Professor Sachs, how do the views of President Kennedy on nuclear test bans and respect for Russian culture compare to the actions of our current leaders, particularly regarding the three potential conflict areas you mentioned that risk a wider or even nuclear war?
Absolutely. We not only do not show respect for our counterparts, we show open hostility and I would say trash talking. I refer to three counterparts. First, to Russia. The narrative about Russia that Putin is the new Hitler, that there's no talking to Putin, that war is the only way to protect Ukraine, is all warmongering propaganda of the military-industrial complex. It is false. It doesn't pass the test of any historical accuracy or scrutiny. What has happened is that the United States decided that it was the sole superpower and didn't have to listen to anybody else. And with regard to Russia, it violated every single interest of Russia repeatedly from the 1990s onward. I happen to know this at a personal level because I was an economic advisor to President Gorbachev and to President Yeltsin. They wanted peace and they wanted cooperation. But we said, no, we will run the world, thank you. We will overthrow your allies, whether in Serbia or in Syria or in Iraq or in Libya. We will unilaterally abandon treaties like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty or the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty that Trump left. We will expand NATO contrary to our commitment. We will overthrow regimes in your neighborhood, like we did with Yanukovych in February 2014. We will arm adversaries on your borders. And what are we doing at a human level? We are canceling performances by Russian artists. We are canceling concerts by Russian composers. We are banning the teaching of great Russian novels. It's unimaginable how wrong this approach is in every single way. Kennedy made peace through respect, even at the height of the Cold War. We don't have respect. We have trash talking by Biden, which is a shame of an American president. A shame. He should watch his mouth because he does not behave like he should. Then we have disrespect for the Arab countries the same way. We lie in every way. We wring our hands as 37,000 people die, but we don't do anything to stop the mass killing at all in Gaza. And with regard to China, which has had a remarkable success in raising the living standards of the Chinese people, and incidentally hasn't been in one war for more than 40 years, as we've been in perpetual war, we do nothing but trash talk China. How it's a failure, how its economy will go down, how it's in crisis, how it's warmongering, how it's a danger, how it's a threat to the world. It's vulgar. I go to China several times a year and have done so for decades. And our propaganda is laughable if it were not so troubling. And Biden is part of this as well. So I do not have any admiration for how we're handling things. We're making everything far more dangerous than it should be and needs to be. We could negotiate peaceful relations in all three regions instantly. We could end the war in Ukraine in a day by declaring that NATO will never enlarge to Ukraine, that this was a bad idea, it was a broken promise, it was a danger to Russia, We have to find a different way to have security in the region, so-called collective security, not security at the expense of Russia for Ukraine. And this could lead to a diplomatic outcome. We can end the war in the Middle East by recognizing the state of Palestine, as the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly have called for. And we can end the conflict with China by simultaneously saying we're not going to arm Taiwan, we're not going to get into internal Chinese affairs, but we appeal to China's best interests and the world's best interests for peaceful relations across the Straits of Taiwan. And that will occur as long as the U.S. isn't provoking a conflict by shipping massive armaments to Taiwan. So we have a foreign policy based on war and belligerency, and lo and behold, we continue to approach midnight on the doomsday clock.
Imran Khan is a personal acquaintance and friend of yours, right? Could you speak to that situation a little bit and why it's important for Americans to know about that?
Well, Imran Khan is an extremely fine individual and an excellent leader of Pakistan. The U.S. helped to get him thrown from power. The story is a very unpleasant one. It was exposed by The Intercept. When Imran Khan did not immediately fall into the U.S. camp vis-a-vis Russia and China, the way that the American security state works is if you're not with us, you're against us. Imran Khan said, no, I'm not against anybody. I want good relations with the U.S., with China, with Russia. That doesn't work with the United States. You're with us or you're against us. And so the U.S. senior State Department official called in the Pakistani ambassador and said, we don't like the way that Imran Khan, who was then prime minister, is talking. Maybe it's not good for our relations. Maybe something should be done about it. This was part of a standard U.S. regime change ploy. The note by the Pakistani diplomat was sent back home, and Imran Khan was voted out of office in a vote of no confidence the following month. This is a standard U.S. intervention. Imran Khan said to me, and he said publicly, the United States has gotten me thrown out of power. He was, of course, ridiculed by the U.S. and the Pakistani military for making that claim. Then he got a copy of the memo, the one that The Intercept ended up releasing. And when he waived it, he was charged with espionage. So on the one hand, it didn't exist. On the other hand, charged with espionage. And he was landed in prison before the elections, which were recently held. His party was outlawed as a party. Despite that, the backers of Imran Khan won an overwhelming landslide victory in the election. And then the votes were falsely counted. So they couldn't deny all the votes, but they denied enough of the votes to take away the majority. In other words, even despite imprisonment, even despite these charges, even despite the U.S. ploy, Imran Khan prevailed in the elections, and of course, the ballots were falsely counted, and he was deprived of power, and the U.S. State Department shrugged its shoulders, as it does, because the U.S. State Department does not tell the truth to the world. It does not tell the truth to the American people. The American people would not know anything about this but for the brave word of The Intercept. So this is part of what people should understand more generally is American foreign policy. American foreign policy is depose governments that the U.S. does not like. Don't deal with them, don't negotiate them, try to overthrow them. This can be done by open war, or it can be done covertly. But this is the way that America operates in foreign policy. It is a disaster. It is a disaster for the United States, which has spent trillions of dollars in useless wars on false premises. It is a disaster for the targeted countries, which often are dragged into even decades of instability, such as Afghanistan, where the collapse of Afghanistan came after the CIA was charged with overthrowing an Afghan government in 1979. And this is a story that has happened all over the world. We need a new foreign policy, one that is cooperative, one that is honest, one that protects America through peace and cooperation, not through meddling and regime change operations and wars of choice abroad.
What are your thoughts about the situation about U.S. policy at the moment?
What I wrote in that article was not just about keeping peace, but keeping us away from the nuclear precipice. And I referred to what many people listening will know, the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock is the notional idea of measuring how close we are to nuclear annihilation. It was started by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947 to alert the world that in the new atomic age, of course now we're in the thermonuclear age, we are capable of suicidal destruction of the planet in a way that wasn't true before 1945. And in 1947, these scientists and analysts of the global scene said we were 7 minutes till midnight, meaning that we were at the brink of nuclear war and nuclear annihilation. And of course, the idea was to keep us away from the brink. So what I looked at in that article was which presidents took us closer to midnight and which took us away from midnight. And it was very sobering to look at the clock from the American political point of view. Most American presidents have been failures, in my view, in foreign policy. Most have made the world more dangerous, not less dangerous. Most, of course, have presided over CIA campaigns to overthrow governments around the world. There have been perhaps 90 such regime change operations since 1947. They continue until this day. The U.S. foreign policy is based first and foremost on the principle, if you don't like your opponent, overthrow it, which is a very strange kind of diplomacy. Most diplomacy is if you don't like your opponent, find out a way to live together, actually have diplomacy. Even compromise, a word that's a completely dirty word in our lexicon. It became, quote, appeasement. It became one model, which is compromise means death. This is the psychology. So never compromise, never agree with an adversary, only defeat or overthrow an adversary. This is what most presidents have done. We have had a few skilled presidents, and Eisenhower was one of them, although it's a complicated record because he was a fiscal conservative. He didn't want to spend a lot of money, so he thought literally you get a lot of bang for the buck with nuclear weapons. So he was part of the arms race, but he also understood that there needed to be an agreement with the Soviet Union. President Kennedy saved the world after almost stumbling into nuclear annihilation in 1961 in the Bay of Pigs CIA operation to overthrow the Cuban government. And then in 1962, the disaster on both sides of the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union put in offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba, and we came the closest we've ever come to nuclear annihilation. But then Kennedy and his counterpart Nikita Khrushchev were smart enough, human enough, decent enough, thoughtful enough, rational enough to pull us back from the brink and actually enter into what then became for years and even decades a nuclear arms control framework, starting with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Johnson put us closer to midnight again. Then Nixon, much reviled by me, by the way, in my youth, and by much of society, and of course forced to resign over Watergate, took us away from midnight through so-called détente in the early 1970s and his opening to China. And that was very clever. Jimmy Carter, who I liked as a president, contrary to much foreign policy, actually took us back towards midnight, to my chagrin, because we all learned decades after the fact and directly from the strategic author, the tactical author of this blunder, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was very proud of having assigned the CIA to run jihadists in Afghanistan, starting in 1979, with the idea of entrapping the Soviet Union in an Afghan invasion. So we created what became Al-Qaeda, what became the jihadist terrorism. This was a CIA op. Yes, it entrapped the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It entrapped Afghanistan in what became more than 4 decades of U.S. completely created disaster. And it took the world back towards midnight. So Carter failed. The apogee of safety was Reagan and George Bush 1, because this was the end of the Cold War. We thought, didn't we? And this also, of course, was due to somebody who has a very mixed opinion. There's a very mixed opinion about him. I knew him. I actually worked for his economic team. I'm speaking of Mikhail Gorbachev. One thing I can tell you for certain is that Mikhail Gorbachev was a man of peace, which is absolutely remarkable. And unilaterally, he disbanded the Soviet military machine in Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called Warsaw Pact Alliance. And to their credit, both Reagan and Bush Sr. cooperated with Gorbachev relatively straightforwardly. And by the end of Bush Sr., we were 17 minutes from midnight. That means the farthest from nuclear war ever. But a funny thing happened on the way to peace, and that is the point of today, which is the U.S. could not take yes for an answer. We could not accept the idea of peaceful, mutually respectful, transparent cooperation with Russia. We just couldn't accept it. And by the way, what is fascinating looking back, it wasn't even about communism, which was the great bogeyman of the age. It was about Russia. Because as communism ended, as the Soviet Union ended, now we know, and this I think is the main point for our day, we know that as early as 1992, the goal, as expressed by then Defense Secretary Richard Cheney, who became perhaps the most influential single architect of American foreign policy for the next 20 years, was not only to end the Soviet threat or the communist threat, but to dismember Russia as well. Cheney's argument in 1992 was, well, the Soviet Union dissolved. Let's do the same with Russia. Russia can dissolve. And a very insightful way to understand this remarkably dangerous, bizarre, irresponsible, reckless idea is an article by Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the architects of all of this period, in 1997, in an essay in Foreign Affairs magazine called A Strategy for Eurasia. And Brzezinski just casually notes, maybe we need 3 Russias in a loose confederation, maybe a European Russia, maybe a Siberian Russia, maybe a Far East Russia. Together, yes, but in a loose confederation. The point of reading this is to think about the arrogance, the hubris of American foreign policy, that it's going to dismember Russia. And that, I believe, has been the more than 30-year campaign. Dismember, surround, regime change operation, you name it. But we've got Russia on the ropes. The Soviet Union went down because we defeated it, not because of Gorbachev, not because of peace, not because of making a cooperative offering, but because we are the unipolar power of the world. No one comes close. The greatest colossus in world history, greater than the Roman Empire. This is how American leaders thought back in the 1990s. We have a president who lives today in the 1990s, Biden. This is his formation. It may be his current mental apparatus for all I know, but it is his phraseology till today, the indispensable country, the sole superpower, the country that the whole world turns to for leadership. And the idea was, from the start, weaken, dismember, overthrow Russia. We are the sole superpower. So that's where NATO enlargement came in. That's where the U.S. support for jihadists around Russia's boundaries, whether in Chechnya or in the former Yugoslavia, came in, breaking apart Serbia in 1999 with the deliberate attempt to weaken a Russian ally, as well as to implant a NATO base in a, quote, new country, Kosovo. Oh, you're not supposed to change the map. The United States changed the map to have a NATO military base in Bondesteel and to break apart Serbia. 2002, withdraw from the ABM treaty unilaterally, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, put in Aegis missile systems in Poland and Romania starting in 2010, and of course, expand NATO to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Another Brzezinski project spelled out in 1997, stealing, as we've discussed in the past, from Lord Palmerston's ideas of the 1850s. Some ideas, some horrible ideas never die, and this one was brought back to life. But the point, Alexander, is that the presidents from Clinton onward, every single one, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden, every single one has moved us closer to midnight in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock. And we are now 90 seconds to midnight. Are you kidding? 90, they're trying to tell us something. And it's true. And if you don't hear it from the Doomsday Clock, just listen to any stupid European politician these days. Because one is more stupid than the next. Let's taunt Russia. Let's provoke Russia. Of course, let's bomb Russia. Let's destroy Russia, says the big Baltic state presidents that want to bring us to nuclear disaster. One after the other makes no rational sense at all. Biden is adrift. He can't lead. So we are, as I have been thinking, with a stuck rudder heading towards the precipice, heading towards midnight, if you will, in the Doomsday Clock metaphor. And every day is bringing us closer, because we have a 3-front conflict right now, not one of which is being tamped down. We have Ukraine, we have the Middle East, and it's not only Israel's crazed and genocidal assault in Gaza, it's Israel's continuing attacks on Iran to bring the United States into a war with Iran. Good idea, Israel. Now we need hear today, even from the New York Times, no less, it's Israel's fake bot campaign on social media to continue to influence U.S. Congress. We don't even need to know about the fake social accounts because the Israel lobby is powerful enough that it has held Congress in its thrall all this period. And we have the third front in Asia. As if it isn't enough, we are absolutely talking every day now. We have politicians, these are grown-ups, at least in appearance and by birth date, talking about war with China. So this is a kind of collective insanity. And incidentally, I had an interview with Tucker Carlson recently, and it generates a lot of viewers and a lot of mail. And I got one just before we started from Germany saying that, Professor Sachs, I enjoyed your interview, but you expressed a little bit of puzzlement about what is Germany doing and why is it so self-destructive and so forth. And then it went into a very intelligent discussion about how Germany and every country where this gentleman has worked in academia is completely under the U.S. mystique and U.S. thrall and U.S. influence peddling and U.S. money and military-industrial complex. So he says completely impossible in the continental European context to say anything in academia that is against the United States. I don't have that direct sense, but it's shocking because I always thought, and again, I'm a naive guy, it takes me a long time to understand these things, but I thought Europe's the sophisticated one. 2,000 years of history. Europe's got the diplomacy. Europe's seen everything. It's done everything. It understands everything. But what I'm hearing from a lot of people is that there's no real debate anywhere in continental Europe right now. And we know in Britain, I always say Britain taught America everything it knows about all of this, all of this danger and saber rattling and wars of choice. And here we are. So 5 presidents in a row carrying us closer to nuclear annihilation than ever, and an American political system utterly and completely incapable of addressing this right now. Elections don't matter in November. This is something beyond the elections. This is something about the mentality, about the scale of the military-industrial complex, about the depth of these long-term projects, about the special role of the CIA in American society, because almost surely the most powerful institution in the land and the least known and least understood by design. And interestingly, just one last point of the rant, and sorry to carry on, but when there's a real negotiation in the Middle East, when you really need to sit down to talk with Hamas, who goes from the United States? Not Blinken, but Burns, the CIA director. This is not an incidental point. What the hell is the CIA director doing negotiating this arrangement? The CIA is supposed to be an intelligence agency. Of course, we know it's a secret army. But it's amazing to see that. CIA director should not be the negotiator. But the CIA director is the negotiator because that's the real power in the American system right now.
Basically, it started very simply, which is that the United States government, let's not call it the U.S. people, they had nothing to do with this, but the U.S. government said, we're going to put Ukraine on our side, and we're going to go right up to that 2,100-kilometer border with Russia. We're going to put our troops and NATO and maybe missiles, whatever we want, because we are the sole superpower of the world, and we do what we want. And it goes back, actually, a long way. It goes back 170 years. The Brits had this idea first, surround Russia in the Black Sea region, and Russia's not a great power anymore. And that was Lord Palmerston's idea in the Crimean War 1853 to 1856. And the Brits taught us what we know about empire. And they basically taught us the idea, Russia, it needs an outlet. It needs an outlet to the Middle East. It needs an outlet to the Mediterranean. You surround Russia in the Black Sea. You have rendered Russia a second or third rate country. And Zbig Brzezinski, one of our lead geostrategists of the current era, wrote in 1997, let's do this. Let's make sure that we basically surround Russia in the Black Sea region. They got this idea that we'll expand NATO so that every country in the Black Sea around Russia is a NATO country. Right now, back then, Turkey was a NATO country. But we said, okay, we'll get Romania and Bulgaria. And we'll get Ukraine, and we'll get Georgia. Now, Georgia, not our Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Georgia of the Black Sea.
We used to call it Soviet Georgia.
Yes, Soviet Georgia, if you want to call it that.
Home of Stalin.
It's not NATO North Atlantic. It's way out there on the eastern edge of the Black Sea region. People can look at a map. But we said, yeah, we'll make Georgia part of NATO too. And the reason was very clear, and Zbig was very explicit about it, that this is our way to basically dominate Eurasia. If we can dominate the Black Sea region, then Russia's nothing. If we make Russia nothing, then we can basically control Eurasia, meaning all the way from Europe to Central Asia, and through our influence in East Asia, do the same thing. And that's American unipolarity. We run the world. We are the hegemon. We are the sole superpower. We are unchallenged. So that's the idea.
But why would you want that? Why would the Brits want that? Why does the U.S. State Department want that? What about Russia, which is not actually much of an expansionist power, is so threatening?
It's not about Russia. It's about the U.S. It's about Britain before that. I think it's a little bit like that old game of Risk. I don't know if you played that as a kid, but the idea was have your piece on every place in the world. That was the game. And you read the American strategists, whether it's Zbig Brzezinski, although he was a very moderate, or the neocons who have run U.S. foreign policy for the last 30 years, the neocons are very explicit. The U.S. must be the unchallenged superpower in every place in the world, in every region. We must dominate. It's quite a load for us American people. What they say is we are going to be the constabulary duty holder. What fancy word for saying we'll be the world's policeman. They say it explicitly. They say that's lots of wars. We have to be ready for all these wars. To my mind, it's a little crazy. But their idea was, after the end of the Soviet Union, well, now we run the world. And to come back to Russia, the idea was, well, Russia's weak, it's down, we're the sole superpower, they're on their back or on their knees, whatever it is, and now we can move NATO where we want, and we can surround them. And the Russians said, please don't do that, don't bring your troops, your weapons, your missiles right up to our border. It's not a good idea. And the U.S., I was around in those years, involved in Russia and in Central Europe. The U.S. was, we don't hear you, we do what we want. They kept pushing. Inside the U.S. government in the 1990s, when this debate was going, should NATO expand, some people said, yeah, but we told Gorbachev and we told Yeltsin we weren't going to expand at all. No, come on, the Soviet Union's done, we can do what we want, we're the sole superpower. Clinton bought into that. That was Madeleine Albright's line. NATO enlargement started, and our most sophisticated diplomats, we used to have diplomats at the time, we don't have them anymore, but we used to have diplomats like George Kennan, said this is the greatest mistake we could possibly make. We had a defense secretary, Bill Perry, who was Clinton's defense secretary who agonized, God, I should resign over this. This is terrible. What's going on? But he was outmaneuvered diplomatically by Richard Holbrooke and by Madeleine Albright, and Clinton never thought through anything systematically, in my opinion. And so they decided, okay, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, first round. And then Brzezinski, in a 1997 article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is kind of the bellwether of foreign policy, wrote a strategy for Eurasia where he laid out exactly the timeline for this U.S. expansion of power. And he said late 1990s, we'll take in Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. By the early 2000s, we'll take in the Baltic states. Now that's getting close to Russia. By 2005 to 2010, we'll invite Ukraine to become part of NATO. So this wasn't some flippant thing. This was a long-term plan, and it was based on a long-term geostrategy. Now the Russians are saying, are you kidding? We wanted peace. We ended the Cold War too. You didn't just defeat us. We said no more. We disbanded the Warsaw Pact. We wanted peace. We wanted cooperation. You call it victory. We just wanted to cooperate. I know that for a fact because I was there in those years. What Gorbachev wanted, what Yeltsin wanted. They didn't want war with the United States, nor were they saying we're defeated. They were saying we just want to cooperate. We want to stop the Cold War. We want to become part of a world economy. We want to be a normal economy. We want to be a normal society connected with you, connected with Europe, connected with Asia. And the U.S. said, we get it, we won, you do everything we say, and we determine how the pieces are going to go. So, in the early 2000s, Putin comes in. First business for Putin was good cooperation with Europe.
Yes.
You go back to the early 2000s. Again, I know the people. I watched closely. I was a participant in some of it. Putin was completely pro-Europe.
Yes.
And pro-U.S., by the way.
I know.
And we don't want to talk about this. We don't want to admit it because we don't want anything other than unprovoked. So everything is phony, what we say. Everything is a lie. But just to say, the U.S. kept doing unilateral things that were really outrageous. In 1999, we bombed Belgrade for 78 days. Bad move. Absolutely. We bombed a capital of Europe for 78 days.
Looking back, what was the point of that?
The point of that was to break Serbia in two, create a new state, Kosovo, where we have the largest NATO military base in Southeast Europe. We put Bondesteel base there because we wanted a base in Southeastern Europe. And again, you look at the neocons, it's nice of them. They actually describe all of this in various documents. You have to make the links, but in a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses in the year 2000, they say the Balkans is a new strategic area for the U.S., so we have to move large troops to the Balkans because their idea is literally the game of risk. Not just you need good relations or peace, we need our pieces on the board. We need military bases with advanced positioning of our military everywhere in the world. So they wanted a big base in Southeastern Europe. They didn't like Serbia. Serbia was close to Russia. Anyway, we're the sole superpower. We do what we want. So they divided the country, which they now claim that you never do. You never change borders. We broke apart Serbia, established by our declaration a new country, Kosovo. We put a huge NATO base there, and that was the goal. So that was 1999.
So it wasn't to save the oppressed Muslim population?
Excuse me?
It wasn't to save the oppressed Muslim population?
It was very, very much to save the military-industrial complex to have a nice location in Southeastern Europe.
It killed all those people, wrecked the city.
You know, it was a little bit sad, but we do lots of sad things and lots of destructive things, lots of wars. We're the country of perpetual war. we don't look back. We're not even supposed to talk about this because this was unprovoked, remember? So in 2002, the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Unilaterally. Well, that was one of the stabilizers of the relationship with Russia, and it was one of the stabilizers of the global nuclear situation, which is absolutely dangerous. And the U.S. unilaterally started putting Aegis missiles into first Poland, then Romania, and the Russians are saying, wait a minute, what do we know you're putting in this? You're a few minutes from Moscow. This is completely destabilizing. Do you think you might want to talk to us? So then comes 2004, 7 more countries in NATO: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now, filling in the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria. Suddenly, they're now North Atlantic countries, but it's all part of this design, all spelled out, all quite explicit. We're surrounding Russia. In 2007, President Putin gave a very clear speech at the Munich Security Conference. Very powerful, very correct, very frustrated, where he said, gentlemen, you told us in 1990 NATO would never enlarge. That was the promise made to President Gorbachev, and it was the promise made to President Yeltsin. And you cheated. And you repeatedly cheated. And you don't even admit that you said this, but it's all plainly documented, by the way, and as you know, in 1,000 archival sites, so it's easy to verify all of this. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And it wasn't a flippant statement, it was a statement repeated and repeated and repeated. Hans Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, same story. The Germans wanted reunification. Gorbachev said, we'll support that, but we don't want that to come at our expense. No, it won't come at your expense. NATO won't move 1 inch eastward, Mr. President. Repeated so many times in many documents, many statements by the NATO Secretary General, by the U.S. Secretary of State, by the German Chancellor, now, of course, all denied by our foreign policy blob, because we're not supposed to remember anything. Remember, this was all unprovoked. So, back to 2007, Putin gives this speech, and he says, stop. Don't even think about Ukraine. This is our 2,100-kilometer border. This is absolutely part of the integrated economy of this region. Don't even think about it. Now, I know from insiders, from all the diplomatic work that I do, that Europe was saying to the U.S., European leaders, don't think about Ukraine, please. This is not a good idea. Just stop. We know from our current CIA director, Bill Burns, that he wrote a very eloquent, impassioned, articulate, clear, secret, as usual, memo, which we only got to see because WikiLeaks showed to the American people what maybe we would like to know once in a while, but we're never told.
Like what our government's doing.
What they're doing and how they're putting us at nuclear risk and other things. Okay, this one did get out, and it's called Niet means Niet, no means no. And what Bill Burns very perceptively, articulately conveys to Condoleezza Rice and back to the White House in 2008 is, Ukraine is really a red line. Don't do it. It's not just Putin. It's not just Putin's government. It's the entire political class of Russia. And just to help all of us as we think about it, it is exactly as if Mexico said, we think it would be great to have Chinese military bases on the Rio Grande. We can't see why the U.S. would have any problem with that. Of course, we would go completely insane. And we should. And we should, of course. The whole idea is so absurdly dangerous and reckless that you can't even imagine grown-ups doing this. So what happens is, for what I'm told by European leaders, and by long, detailed discussion, Bush Jr. says to them, no, it's okay. Don't worry. I hear you about Ukraine. And then he goes off for the Christmas holidays and comes back, whether it's Cheney, whether it's Bush, whatever it is, says, NATO's going to enlarge to Ukraine. And the Europeans are shocked, pissed.
I would like to start by one very profound question. Do you think is the situation now regarding Russia-Ukraine war that serious? That we are on the brink of the World War III, or at least of a big confrontation?
We are definitely on a continued path of escalation. The war is devastating for Ukraine, and the war is escalating. The United States doesn't want to lose. Russia will not lose. And so each side keeps putting in more armaments, more advanced weapons, more attacks that pass the so-called red lines that each other has set. And the war spreads because the United States brings in its allies, even from Asia, into the war in providing materials, munitions, and so on. Russia does the same. And so this is an escalating battle of the two world's largest nuclear superpowers. It's completely reckless and out of control, extraordinarily dangerous in my view.
What were the recent developments that scared you most? Could you name 2 or 3 moments?
One was a couple of weeks ago when Ukraine, it seems, attacked 2 times radar systems that are part of Russia's early warning nuclear attack systems, or nuclear warning systems, I should say. In other words, they are radars that give Russia the information of whether there is an incoming nuclear attack. 2 of these radar systems were hit by Ukrainian drones. When that happened, one of America's leading nuclear war experts immediately contacted me, an academic. He said that he did not believe that people in the White House or the State Department understood how reckless and dangerous that action was. And he asked me to forward materials to the White House and to the State Department and to others, which I promptly did. I think that this illustrates how the Ukrainian side is desperate. It will do anything, even drag the world into nuclear war, because it's a very desperate regime. So this is what's worrisome. I also have very serious doubts about the U.S. leadership at this time. The President of the United States is very old, he's infirm, and I don't believe that we have necessarily a steady hand in the leadership. So all of this concerns me enormously.
When you pass such materials on to the White House, do you get any response, or is it just
No.
black hole?
The emails don't bounce, that I can tell you, but otherwise I don't get any response. I know these people. I sent the message, and that's all that I expected.
You know them personally, people like Jake Sullivan?
Sure.
And would you say, in general, are they receptive?
Not very receptive, no. I think that we have a foreign policy team that has been with a project in Ukraine for more than a decade, that has wanted NATO expansion as a core part of American foreign policy, that has taken what we call the neoconservative view, and I don't think that they're receptive to my views, but I'm not very happy with their views.
People here who are basically in favor of helping Ukraine would say in this situation or in a situation like this, either that Putin is bluffing, so we actually do not have that much to fear from him, or that we, like Central Europe or West in general, have no other choice than oppose Russia and stop Russia as soon as possible. I would like to ask you regarding the first point, which is whether Putin is bluffing. And these people would argue that the Russian president already made various threats during the last 2 years that he draw more red lines, and then every time we crossed, like we the West crossed the red lines, nothing happened basically. So like we did send, or the Americans and Germans and British sent tanks to Ukraine, nothing happened. The Americans provided Ukrainians with a HIMARS system, nothing happened. So what is different now? So why should the last red line, Putin's, or the red lines he is drawing now, why should we take them more seriously than the previous ones?
What's happened in the last 2 years is that 500,000 Ukrainians have died, and the battlefield has raged, and much of Ukraine in the east is being destroyed by war. And people who say, don't worry about nuclear war, make me shudder. Of course we should worry. How can people say, well, it's likely the world won't be destroyed, or don't worry, we haven't crossed Putin's red lines? These people apparently know nothing of history or are willing to gamble the lives of my children and grandchildren because they think that there's nothing to worry about. They don't know. What they fail to understand is the reality of this situation, that we have a major war, that it is escalating, that each side of this war has 6,000 nuclear warheads, that we've come close to the brink of nuclear war on several occasions in history, sometimes by accident, sometimes by a hot-headed leader, sometimes by a mistake on the radar screen. We need absolutely to be a little bit smarter than saying, oh, don't worry about it.
Maybe just the people think that that they do not want to look like cowards who gave up to Putin's threats.
But the problem is that people don't understand what this is all about. They don't understand the origins of this crisis. They don't understand how this has evolved. They don't understand the role of the United States in this. Of course, the people of the Czech Republic may love the United States because, well, we know the history of the Cold War and so forth, but they don't really understand the United States, and they don't understand what this crisis is, and they don't understand what Russia's concerns are also. Of course, again, after domination by the Soviet Union for so many decades and such a terrible period in Czech history, people don't want to think about it other than good and evil, but they need to understand, because we need to avoid nuclear war and we need to avoid the destruction of Ukraine. And people who think that they are Ukraine's friends right now are doing Ukraine, not purposely, but inadvertently, a huge disservice. Ukraine is being destroyed right now because of this ongoing war, and we are not seeing in Europe any attempt to end the war. And people in Europe don't understand, it seems to me, the roots of this war. And so that is really my main problem. I don't want to gamble the future of the world because somebody has a hunch of what Russia may or may not do. That's not the way to behave as responsible people in this world. And I want people to think clearly about where this conflict arose, because it's not as we tell ourselves in fairy tales. It's a bit more complicated. And I want people to think about how the war can actually be ended. Because when people say, as they do, oh, we must defeat Russia, I don't think people are thinking very clearly about what it means to defeat a country with 6,000 nuclear warheads. Well, they say, oh, don't worry about it. But that is an excuse for thinking. That's not real thinking.
You'll come to this immediately. I just wanted to ask one specific question. You mentioned Ukraine's losses, and you used the figure 500,000 dead people. How do you know? So Ukrainian estimates, the official estimates are of course very low, and no one basically trusts them. But yours are on the other side very high.
I listen to every side. I listen to Ukrainian channels. I listen to Russian channels. I listen to American channels. I listen to British channels. I read every side of this issue. I watch the battlefield accounts. Nobody knows for sure. But the losses are enormously high. The graveyards across Ukraine are everywhere. I don't know if people are watching the videos. Maybe they're not shown in the Czech Republic or not, of young people being dragged off the streets in Ukraine to be sent to the front line. I know from direct reports. I know from people involved. I know from emails that I get that a whole generation of Ukrainians has been lost, dead and wounded, or escaped. This is a tragedy of massive proportions. I know that what Zelensky said about 31,000 dead is so sadly false that it's even a shame to propagandists. Propagandists should do and say things that at least have an air of plausibility, not absurdity. And unfortunately, Zelensky often speaks absurdity because he thinks that that's what the paymasters in the United States want to hear.
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, 2 points people usually make here about Putin. So the first was Putin is bluffing, and the second is that we actually should take Russia deadly serious because Russia is inherently imperial power. And if we do not stop them in Ukraine, then they will go on and on to the west and be in the Czech Republic, in Germany, maybe in France, like in a couple of years. Do you think, so to me, this is probably the most profound question about this war. From the Russian point of view, do you think is this war an act of aggression, or do they think they are actually on defense, the Russians?
The Russians absolutely think that they are on the defensive side, and while that may seem extraordinary to people listening, it's really important to understand the history of this current conflict. It's also really important to avoid easy national stereotypes. Russia is not the Soviet Union, first of all, and also what happened, however tragic in the past, doesn't have to repeat in the future. Do people in the Czech Republic say the same thing about Germany as they say about Russia? If ever there were a country that damaged the world, it was Germany. in the 20th century twice. And yet I believe that Germany is now an ally of the Czech Republic. It's part of NATO. Do people in the Czech Republic say, well, Germany's likely to invade us? You see, they did in 1939. You see, they are Nazis. You see, Germany is always expansionist. This is their very nature. This is the kind of talk that is wrong and destructive and simplistic and dangerous. Yes, it's easy to have enemies. It's easy to make wars that are not needed because you create the inhuman enemy on the other side, and then you take actions to protect yourself against the inhuman enemy, and they interpret your actions as aggressive, and they take actions, and then you say, you see, that proves they are inhuman. The Russians are beasts. They're just imperialists. They're just expansionists. Well, okay, if you say so, what about Germany? Do you feel the same way? Yes, we can't trust Germany. They're Nazis. Well, I don't think we want to say that. I don't think that this is correct. A very wise president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, said something very smart 61 years ago when he spoke to the Parliament of Ireland. He said, across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme law of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and our common vulnerability on this planet. This is very smart. Across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember there are no permanent enemies. Hostility is a fact, but it is not the supreme law. Let us have some sense and understand history and understand how to resolve conflicts and stop talking about, oh, I don't think nuclear war is so likely, let's go ahead. As if this is a casual decision like rolling the dice or playing a board game. It is not. This is life and death, and we should be a lot more serious than we are in how our public discourse goes. We are not living in 1938. We are not living in 1968. We are living in 2024, and we had better take responsibility for 2024.
Coming back to the origins of this Russia-Ukraine war, how would the Russians come to believe that they were being cheated by the West? Or
well, I know it because I have been involved in Russia and Ukraine and a little bit in the Czech Republic and Poland and all over the region.
In the early 90s.
For 35 years, even before the early 90s, starting in 1989. I have watched close up. I knew President Gorbachev. I knew President Yeltsin. I know President Kuchma. I know the leadership of the region. I watched this. The problem is the following. In 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to end the Cold War. He didn't want to be defeated by the United States. He wanted to end the Cold War. He disbanded the Warsaw Pact, and his Western counterparts at the highest levels promised NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward. By the way, all of that is very well documented, but probably your president would stand up and say, that's a lie, Mr. Sachs. But it's not a lie. It's all carefully documented. People can find it online if they care to look in a place called the National Security Archive, which is maintained by George Washington University. And they can look at a website that's called What Gorbachev Heard. and another website that's called What Yeltsin Heard. Because what they heard from the U.S. Secretary of State James Baker III, what they heard from the German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, was that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. Now, of course, this was a lie of the U.S., because the U.S. already starting in 1991-92 said, we've won the Cold War. Now we run the world. We are the unipolar power. We can do what we want. Our defense secretary in 1992 was Richard Cheney. If anyone thinks he's a nice man, you should read something to understand about Richard Cheney.
Secretary back then?
He was defense secretary for George H.W. Bush Sr., and then he was the man who launched the Iraq War in 2003 on false premises. He believed in U.S. supremacy. He believed in U.S. hegemony. He believed in a U.S. unipolar world. He believed literally the United States is the policeman of the world. Constibulatory duties, he called it, he and his colleagues in the neoconservative movement. They had a grandiose and arrogant vision of the United States, and they believed that they had won the Cold War. Now the United States can do what it wants. So despite these promises, NATO began to move eastward, of course, to the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary first in 1999, in complete contradiction to the promises that were given to Yeltsin and to Putin. So that's the first reason for concern.
Can I interrupt you? There is one counter-argument to this. This famous sentence.
It wasn't a sentence, by the way. It was multiple meetings, multiple documents, multiple discussions. It wasn't a sentence.
I thought these specific words about not 1 inch eastwards
applied only to Germany.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, this is
the favorite argument.
This is U.S. propaganda. Please look at the National Security Archives of George Washington University, not the spin of the U.S. government.
So it's
period.
You think
this was clear. This was explicit. This was heatedly debated inside the U.S. government in the mid-1990s. Our defense secretary under William Clinton, whose name is William Perry, almost resigned under protest. He said, we are cheating. He said, this is so unwise. Our leading scholar statesman of the era, named George Kennan, the man who famously coined the idea of containment of the Soviet Union in 1946-47, said this is the worst decision the Americans have taken since the end of the Cold War. It will lead to a new crisis. So this was not a sentence. This was not a trick. This is not a matter of semantics. This was a matter of policy. And the United States cheated.
Yeah.
Then the United States continued its unilateralism. I know people in Prague won't want to hear this necessarily, or people in the Czech Republic, because America's the good side. And they say yes, and it protects us. But please understand the view from the other side. In 1999, the United States bombed Belgrade for 78 straight days. This is the first war in Europe after 1945. I'm not talking about, of course, the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1968. I'm talking about the open war. And the U.S. bombed Belgrade for 78 days because they wanted to break Serbia in two. And they wanted to put a NATO base in Kosovo, which they have done. And it's the Eastern Command for the Balkans region in Bond Steel base in Kosovo. That was 1999, completely against international law.
They would argue they had to stop the ongoing genocide back then in Kosovo.
Yes, they would argue that, but almost anyone that actually knows the facts knows that the United States gave an ultimatum to Milosevic that was designed to be rejected because Madeleine Albright wanted to go to war against. I mentioned Madeleine Albright. I know she has a new street named after her, but I have to say she was a warmonger also. She wanted war against Milosevic. Period.
Yeah.
These are facts, and they are well known. And, even afterwards, whatever the explanation one gives for 78 days of bombing Belgrade illegally, why a new country? Oh, because the United States wanted to break apart Serbia. Where is the sacred lines of nations? Well, only when the U.S. Doesn't want the country to be divided. So the U.S. often divides other countries, like it did with Sudan and South Sudan, joining in that civil war, like it did in Serbia, dividing Kosovo. Then to understand the Russian point of view. In 2002, the U.S. unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was of grave concern to the Russians. It was a reckless move by one of our most reckless presidents, but certainly our most reckless vice president in history, Richard Cheney. It was part of the new order of American unipolarity. We don't need treaties anymore. We will do what we want. And the United States started putting in its Aegis missile systems in Poland and in Romania, and the Russians were absolutely aghast and furious. You have treaty commitments. The U.S. said, no, we don't. We don't have treaty commitments anymore. Then, just to move the chronology, NATO expanded to 7 more countries in 2004. And this included the 3 Baltic states, so very close to Russia. This included Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. So leave the anti-ballistic missile treaty, expand NATO to 7 more countries. And then in 2003, the United States went to war in Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein on totally false premises. They were obviously false. This isn't that we were surprised we got there and there weren't weapons of mass destruction. They went to war on false premises, claiming that they knew that there were weapons of mass destruction. Russia was watching once again because Saddam Hussein was an ally of Russia. Well, that war then went on for the next 20 years. The next one to come was in 2011. President Obama, very much liked, he gave a famous speech in Prague, of course, on peace. And in 2011, he tasked the CIA with overthrowing the Syrian government.
How do we know?
Well, how do we know? Oh, that's all very well documented, but not covered in public. It's called Operation Timber Sycamore. And the presidential findings in 2012 and 2013 are well known, but we know in 2011 that President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said explicitly, that man must go. In other words, the President of the United States said that the President of Syria must go. They said that publicly. That wasn't hidden. They started massive arms shipments. They started a CIA operation. The exact timing of all of the findings is not known. But we do know, and you can look it up in the New York Times, they covered it one day because that's how the American propaganda works. They didn't tell the American people that the U.S. had gone to war with Syria. It was a CIA covert operation.
Basically helping Al Qaeda in the end.
It was to fund jihadists like Al Qaeda, together with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to overthrow the Syrian government. This is what it was. But by the way, people don't necessarily know, but the United States government does this for a living. This isn't a rare occurrence. The United States has been engaged in around 90 regime change operations, mostly led by the CIA. This is why the U.S. is viewed as very dangerous by countries like Russia, because the U.S. has a covert army as well as an overt army, and the U.S. intention is not favorable to countries that the United States does not like. It's not trying to find stability, it's trying to overthrow them. Even in the case of Russia, it's well known that Cheney and Zbigniew Brzezinski both talked about dividing Russia, dismembering Russia, weakening Russia internally. Cheney said in 1992, well, now the Soviet Union's at an end, why not Russia as well? This is discussed in memoirs of people. This isn't public documents in this case. This is discussed in the memoirs of people, like Robert Gates, former CIA director. But if you are a student of American politics, as I am, these things are not a surprise or an aberration. They are how American politics works. The U.S. has overthrown or tried to overthrow dozens and dozens of governments around the world. Now, this brings us to 2014. The U.S. engaged in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in the Maidan in 2014. Of course, I think in the history that's told in the Czech Republic, people are said, well, that was the revolution of dignity.
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
the Ukrainian people. I happened to see with my own eyes the U.S. funding the Maidan. Please don't be naive. I saw it for a very particular reason, which was after the Maidan had violently overthrown Yanukovych, violently, I was asked by the new post-coup government, please, Mr. Sachs, come and discuss our economic crisis. I didn't know better, so I flew to Kyiv, and then somebody showed me and explained to me how the U.S. had funded the Maidan. They laid it out. They actually walked me through the Maidan because there were still crowds there. They explained to me the U.S. funding. You know, it made me sick. But just to tell you, this is not innocent operation. This is not an overthrow. The United States recognized a government brought in by a violent coup within one day. Now, why did it do that? Why didn't it say that Viktor Yanukovych is the constitutional president and he should be allowed to serve out his term? And you probably know that 3 European foreign ministers had negotiated with Yanukovych a deal for early elections that were going to come later in 2014. And then the leaders of the coup said, no early elections, we take power. And the United States recognized the new government immediately. Do you think that this is an innocent coincidence? I do not. And if you have any doubt, please listen to Victoria Nuland on tape, intercepted by the Russians in late January 2014, speaking with the U.S. ambassador at the time, Jeffrey Piat. And it's on tape. You can listen to the BBC website.
I did.
Okay, and she talks about who the new government is, who it's going to be. It's not going to be Klitschko. It's going to be Yeltsinuk. And you know what? It was Yats who called me to say, come meet with me afterwards. I didn't know, of course. But this is the clearest direct U.S. meddling in the internal politics of Ukraine.
Bima apain HP-nya ini Bima? Ini kenapa bisa loading terus dia m-bankingnya? Kok nggak tahu Mima apain tadi malam ini? Nanti Mima apa nggak upgrade iOS gak?
दोस्तों इसके लिए आपने कौन सा क्लिप को यूज़ करना है, यानी कि मैं एक क्लिप ये है, मैं इस क्लिप को करना चाहता हूँ, यानी कि बहुत कम स्पीड में करना चाहता हूँ। तो इसके लिए मुझे क्या करना होगा? इसके लिए मुझे इस दूसरे नंबर क्लिप स्पीड पर जाना होगा। मैं यानी कि अब स्पीड बढ़ाना चाहता हूँ, यानी कि बहुत ज़्यादा करना चाहता हूँ। इसके लिए मुझे क्या करना पड़ेगा दोस्तों? ये 2x दोस्तों पहले कहाँ पर थी? पहले 1x पर थी ना। तो अब आपने क्या करना है, इधर ये दाएं तरफ जाते जाना है। 1.5x 2x 3x 2.5 जितनी ज़्यादा करना। अब मैंने बहुत अब ये देखो ना वीडियो किस तरह से बहुत जल्दी में हो जाएगी ये। दोस्तों इसी तरह से आप बहुत ज़्यादा स्पीड, और इसके अगर आप वीडियो की स्पीड बहुत कम करना चाहते हैं तो उसके लिए आपको क्या करना पड़ेगा? उसके लिए आपको करना पड़ेगा, फिर आपने स्पीड पर जाना है। अब आपने बाएं तरफ जाना है। इसके लिए ये 3x है ना, 2.5x 2x 1.5x 1.x फिर से। अब देखो ना स्पीड बहुत स्लो स्पीड हो रही है, बहुत स्लो। अब जैसे ही मैंने इसे किया तो बहुत ही यानी कि स्लो। अब देखते हैं कि क्या वीडियो ऐसे बनी है कि नहीं। ये दोस्तों ये बिल्कुल ही ऐसा वीडियो बनी है, देख सकते हो आप। तो अब आपको क्या करना होगा इसके लिए दोस्तों? अब आपको यही करना होगा कि आपको जो क्लिप चाहिए वो आपने लेने हैं। इसके लिए उसके बाद आपको जिसको स्पीड बढ़ाना चाहते हो या घटाना चाहते हो तो आपको वो डिसाइड करना है क्लिप, या फिर पूरी इस तरह की वीडियो भी हो सकती है। ये जो आगे मेरी सारी वीडियो ये भी हो सकती है। इसकी भी स्पीड मैं बढ़ा या घटा सकता हूँ। दाईं तरफ जाऊँगा तो कम होगी, और अगर बाएं तरफ मैं काइन मास्टर को ले जाऊँगा तो ये दोस्तों ये बीच का ऑप्शन मैं आपको समझा भी देता हूँ। ये दोस्तों बीच के ऑप्शन ये वाले इनको दोस्तों करना है। अगर आप दाएं तरफ जाओगे तो कम स्पीड होगी, अगर बाएं तरफ जाओगे तो स्पीड कम होगी। उम्मीद करता हूँ दोस्तों आपको ये वीडियो पसंद आई होगी, और अगर आपको वीडियो पसंद आई है तो आपने वीडियो को लाइक कर देना है और कमेंट में बताना है कि आपको कैसी लगी है वीडियो। और अगर आपको कोई और वीडियो चाहिए तो इसके लिए आपने मेरे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर देना है। तो मिलते हैं किसी और वीडियो में। शुक्रिया।